More than 3,000 years ago, the world's first global economy collapsed. Trade routes that stretched across continents disappeared. Great cities were abandoned. Powerful kingdoms fell within a single generation. Yet, just decades earlier, Egypt, Greece, Canaan, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia had been tied together by one vast trading network. So how did the most connected world of the Bronze Age unravel so completely? 50 years later, almost all of it was gone. Not conquered, not absorbed into some rival empire that took its place. Gone. The Mycenaean palaces burned and never rebuilt. The Hittite Empire wiped off the map entirely, writing itself forgotten across half the region for centuries. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of the strangest mass die-offs of civilization in the archaeological record, because nobody has ever found a single villain responsible for it. And that detail, no single villain, is the thread this video is going to pull on, because if you go looking, the same detail shows up again, and again, and again, in civilization after civilization, 3,000 years apart, on opposite sides of the planet, with nothing in common except that they were made of humans. If this is the kind of pattern that unsettles you a little, stick around, because by the end you're going to see it everywhere, including, if you're willing to look, right where you're sitting now. Hit subscribe before we get into it, because this channel is going to keep pulling on threads like this one, and you don't want to miss where they lead. Let's go back to 1177 BC, because that's the year historian Eric Klein uses as the symbolic endpoint of the Bronze Age world. In that year, a mysterious coalition the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples attacked Egypt itself. The Egyptians won that battle, and it barely mattered, because Egypt was never the same again, and neither was anyone else in the neighborhood. Klein's research, laid out in his book 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, doesn't point to the Sea Peoples as the cause. He points to a pileup, a drought that had been grinding on for decades across the eastern Mediterranean, a string of earthquakes severe, enough that archaeologists call it an earthquake storm, failed harvests, palace revolts, and, critically, the fact that every one of these civilizations depended on every other one for the raw materials that kept their economies running. Cut the trade routes for tin and copper, and you don't just lose bronze. You lose the ability to arm your soldiers, tax your farmers, or pay your bureaucrats. One node fails, and the failure spreads through the network like a power grid going down block by block. Klein has a name for it. A systems collapse. Not an empire got invaded. A whole interconnected system, running at the edge of its own complexity, hit multiple shocks at once and had no slack left to absorb any of them. Within a generation, populations in some regions fell by more than half. It took 300 to 400 years for writing itself to come back to Greece. Here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. That description. An interconnected, highly specialized system, running with no slack, vulnerable to a handful of shocks arriving at once, is not a description unique to the Bronze Age. It is, almost word for word, the diagnosis a modern researcher gave for why complex societies fail, full stop. So let's meet him. In 1988, an anthropologist named Joseph Tainter published a book most people have never heard of, and every serious historian of collapse has had to reckon with ever since: The Collapse of Complex Societies. Tainter's argument is deceptively simple, and it's the spine this entire video is going to hang on. Societies, Tainter says, are problem-solving machines. Every time a society faces a challenge, feeding more people, defending a longer border, managing a bigger bureaucracy, it solves that problem by adding complexity. More administrators, more specialists, more layers of government, more infrastructure. And crucially, societies solve their cheapest, easiest problems first. The harder problems that come later require proportionally more complexity to solve. More energy, more resources, more bureaucracy, for a smaller and smaller return. Tainter calls this declining marginal returns on complexity, and he tested it against real case studies: the Western Roman Empire, the Maya, the Chacon Society of the American Southwest. In every one, he found the same underlying mechanism. The empire keeps adding administrative layers to solve its problems. More legions, more tax collectors, more provincial governors, and each new layer costs more to maintain than the last one delivered in benefit. Eventually, the whole apparatus becomes so expensive to run that it's one bad harvest, one barbarian incursion, one plague away from the entire structure becoming unaffordable, not doomed by any single enemy, doomed by its own overhead. Rome is the case everyone already half knows. By the 4th and 5th centuries AD, the Western Empire wasn't fighting one existential war. It was administering an empire so large, so bureaucratically top-heavy, and so expensive to defend along thousands of miles of frontier that when real shocks arrived, Gothic migrations, breakaway provinces, a debased currency that could no longer pay the legions, there was no capacity left to absorb them. Tainter's chilling observation is that Rome's response The fiscal crisis was almost always the same. Raise taxes, debase the currency further, add more bureaucracy to squeeze more revenue out of a shrinking base. Every fix made the underlying problem of complexity worse, not better. By the time the Western Empire formally ended in 476 AD with the deposition of its last emperor, the collapse had already been unfolding for the better part of a century. Provinces quietly stopped sending tax revenue to Rome. The professional army was increasingly replaced by federated tribes who owed loyalty to their own commanders rather than the emperor, and the imperial bureaucracy kept multiplying committees and offices even as its actual reach over its own territory kept shrinking. The empire didn't fall to the Goths so much as it became too expensive to keep existing, and the Goths simply arrived at the moment it ran out of runway. If you're finding this as unsettling as I did researching it, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because the deeper we go into this pattern, the closer it's going to get to home, and I don't want you to miss the part where we get there. Tainter explains the mechanism. Geographer Jared Diamond, in his 2005 book Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, adds the missing piece. Why societies keep making the choices that kill them, even when the warning signs are staring them in the face. Diamond's most famous case study is Easter Island, Rapa Nui, a speck of land in the Pacific so remote it may be the closest thing history offers to a controlled experiment. No enemies arrived by boat to conquer it. No trading partners abandoned it. Whatever happened to Rapa Nui, the island did to itself. When Polynesian settlers arrived, the island was covered in palm forest. Over generations, the islanders cut those trees down for canoes, for firewood, and famously to move the enormous stone statues, the moai. The chiefs competed to build bigger and grander than their rivals. It was a prestige race, each clan trying to out-monument the last one, and it required timber constantly on an island that could only grow trees so fast. Eventually, there were no trees left. No trees meant no canoes, which meant no way to fish the deep-water species that had fed the population. No trees meant soil erosion, which meant failing crops. Diamond's account describes a society that unraveled into internal warfare and the toppling of the very statues they'd bankrupted themselves to build, followed by a catastrophic population collapse. What makes Rapa Nui the cleanest case Diamond studied is that there's no one else to blame. No invading army, no collapsing trade, partner. Just a society whose elite, competing for status, kept making the same locally rational, collectively suicidal decision year after year, until the resource that decision depended on ran out entirely. Diamond compares this to a chilling modern parallel he found in the historical record. The Norse settlers of Greenland, who arrived with European farming techniques and never abandoned them, even as the climate turned colder and their crops began failing. Generation after generation. Right next door, Inuit hunters were thriving using techniques adapted to exactly those conditions. The Norse, by every account, saw how the Inuit lived, and refused to adopt those methods because doing so would have meant admitting their own identity. Their whole self-conception as European farmers wasn't suited to where they'd chosen to live. The last written record from Norse Greenland is a wedding announcement. After that, silence. Explorers who returned generations later found only ruins. Diamond's conclusion, after studying a dozen such cases, is close to a warning built for exactly this kind of video. Environmental damage on its own rarely destroys a society. Climate shocks, hostile neighbors, and lost trading partners can each matter, but the one factor that shows up in every single collapse he studied, the one that's never absent, is a society's failure to change its own behavior once the warning signs were already unmistakable. If Rapa Nui is Diamond's cleanest case, the classic Maya collapse is his most haunting one. Because unlike a remote Pacific island, the Maya built some of the most sophisticated cities in the pre-industrial world: observatories, water reservoirs, a written language, cities like Tikal and Copan housing tens of thousands of people, in the middle of a rainforest that offered no natural surplus to waste. Beginning in the 8th and 9th centuries AD, city after city in the Maya lowlands stopped erecting monuments, stopped maintaining their water systems, and were abandoned outright, not gradually fading, but in some cases emptying within a human generation. Tree ring and lake sediment data point to a series of severe droughts hitting the region at exactly the wrong moment. A population that had already expanded to the edge of what the land's reservoirs and terraced fields could support, competing states locked into their own arms race of monument building and warfare, and then the rain simply stopped coming for years at a stretch. Tainter would tell you this is the same signature as Rome, a society investing further and further into a system, bigger reservoirs, more elaborate ceremonial architecture, more warrior kings claiming divine favor, chasing diminishing returns, until a shock the system had no slack to absorb arrived and the whole apparatus came apart, faster than anyone inside it could have imagined. The jungle, quite literally, grew back over the plazas within a few generations. Notice what's accumulating here. Bronze Age Mediterranean, Rome, Rapa Nui, the Maya, 4 collapses, 4 continents, or near enough, 3,000 years of separation between the first and the last, and the same skeleton keeps showing up underneath the skin. Complexity that outgrows its returns, elites who keep making the choice that got them their status even after it stops working, and a shock arriving at the exact moment there's no slack left to absorb it. That's not a coincidence anymore, that's a pattern. And there are 2 more pieces of it you need to see before the picture is complete, because they explain not just why complex societies eventually break, but why the people inside them almost never see it coming until it's already happening to them. In 1976, a British general and historian named Sir John Bagot Glubb, a man who had spent decades commanding the Arab Legion and watching empires up close, published a short essay called The Fate of Empires and Search for Survival. Glubb studied roughly a dozen empires, stretching back to Assyria in 859 BC, Persia, Greece under Alexander, Rome, the Arab Caliphate, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, Spain, Romanov Russia, Britain. And he found something that, on the surface, sounds almost too tidy to be real. Nearly every one of them lasted around 250 years, roughly 10 human generations, from the moment of its rise to the moment of its terminal decline. Not exactly 250 to the year, but clustered tightly enough around that number across 3,000 years of wildly different technology, religion, and government, that Glubb concluded the length of empire has almost nothing to do with its politics or its weapons, and almost everything to do with something more human, the exhaustion, generation by generation, of the values that built it in the first place. Glubb mapped out 6 stages every one of these empires passed through, in the same order every time. The Age of Pioneers, a small, unregarded people bursting onto the world stage through sheer audacity and hunger. The Age of Conquests. That audacity turned into disciplined military expansion. The Age of Commerce. Conquered territory turned into trade routes and genuine wealth. The Age of Affluence. Wealth so abundant that the generation that earned it starts raising children who never had to fight for anything. The Age of Intellect. That comfort funding extraordinary universities, art, and philosophy, even as the practical entrepreneurial energy that built the empire starts quietly draining away. And finally, the Age of Decadence, a stage Glubb describes with a bluntness that should make anyone watching this uncomfortable. Increasing focus on money and entertainment over duty, a widening gap between rich and poor, a loss of religious or civic conviction, and, his words, a society whose citizens no longer make the effort to save themselves because they're no longer convinced there's anything left worth saving. Glubb wrote about the Baghdad of the 10th century in the declining years of the Arab Empire and quoted contemporary historians complaining about the exact things every declining society's critics complain about. The corruption of officials who somehow grow rich in public office, the collapse of sexual and religious mores among the young, a popular culture obsessed with celebrity singers over serious ideas. He wasn't quoting the present. He was quoting writers who'd been dead for 1,000 years, describing a pattern that apparently repeats itself with the reliability of a season changing. If any of that is starting to sound uncomfortably familiar, that's not an accident, and it's not paranoia either. It's the reason this pattern is worth understanding in the first place. Before we get to the piece that explains why nobody inside a declining empire ever seems to notice it happening, go ahead and share this video with someone who'd find this as unsettling as you probably do right now, because the next part is the piece that ties the whole thing together. Here's the question. All of this leaves hanging. If the pattern is this consistent, why doesn't anyone ever stop it? Why does every single one of these societies walk into the same trap, generation after generation, civilization after civilization, as if none of them had ever read a history book? A modern researcher named Peter Turchin thinks he's found the mechanical answer, and it's arguably the most important piece of this entire puzzle, because it's the one that's measurable in real time, in real data, right now. Turchin calls his field cryodynamics, literally the mathematics of history, and the core engine of his model is a concept called elite overproduction. Every complex society, Turchin argues, has a limited number of genuinely elite positions, seats of political power, top military commands, the highest tiers of wealth and status. During prosperous periods, that society naturally produces more people qualified for those positions than there are positions to fill, more graduates of elite institutions, more wealthy families, more credentialed professionals, all competing for a fixed or shrinking number of thrones. When that competition intensifies past a certain point, Turchin's data across centuries of documented history shows the same outcome again and again. Those excess elites don't just quietly accept a smaller life. Some of them turn into counter-elites, ambitious, resourced, aggrieved people willing to break the rules of the existing order to get the status they believe they're owed. Turchin combines this with an idea he borrows from Thomas Malthus and updates with real data. Population growth that outpaces the productivity of the land eventually pushes down real wages for ordinary people, even as elite numbers keep growing. You get a society that looks, from a distance, wealthier than ever, more graduates, more billionaires, more institutions, while ordinary living standards quietly stagnate or fall, and the ranks of the disappointed and ambitious swell far past what the system's actual seats of power can absorb. Turchin's own historical data sets catalog through what he calls secular cycles, spanning 2 to 3 centuries, show this precise combination: elite overproduction plus popular immiseration as the single most reliable predictor of civil war, revolution, and state breakdown across recorded history, from Rome to Han China to the French Revolution. And here's why nobody sees it coming from the inside. Elite overproduction doesn't feel like decline while it's happening. It feels like success: more universities, more graduates, more people with the credentials and ambition to lead. It's only decades later, once those excess elites have spent a generation fighting each other for a fixed number of seats, that the fracture shows up as instability. Nobody quite remembers seating. Turchin has gone further than most historians are usually willing to, and actually put numbers on this for a modern society. In his book Ages of Discord, he tracks the United States across the entire 20th and early 21st centuries using exactly this framework: relative wages, the ratio of elite aspirants to elite positions, rates of political violence, and identifies recurring waves of instability roughly 80 to 90 years apart, driven by the same combination every time: a growing gap between how many people are credentialed for power and how many seats of power actually exist, layered on top of stagnating living standards for everyone else. He's careful to frame this as a diagnosis, not a prophecy. The data describes pressure building, not a fixed date when something breaks, but the fact that a mathematical model built entirely from studying Rome, Han China, and medieval France produces a coherent, testable prediction about the present at all is, on its own, a reason this framework gets taken seriously by historians who otherwise have very little patience for grand unified theories of civilization. Stack every piece of this next to each other and the picture stops being a coincidence and starts being a mechanism. Tainter tells you complex societies keep solving problems by adding complexity, until the complexity itself costs more than it returns. Diamond tells you the fatal ingredient is never the environmental shock alone. It's a society's refusal to change course even after the warning signs are unmistakable, because changing course would mean abandoning the very identity and status structure that made the society successful in the first place. Glubb tells you this isn't random. It follows a rough, repeatable timeline, generation by generation, as the hunger that built the civilization is slowly replaced by comfort, and comfort is slowly replaced by an inability to believe anything is worth real sacrifice to protect. And Turchin gives you the engine room, a measurable data-backed mechanism: too many people competing for too few seats of real power, feeding on a population that's stopped getting materially better off, that turns quietly, invisibly, decade after decade, until it produces exactly the kind of fracture that turns a bad harvest, a lost battle, or a currency crisis into the final shock a brittle system can no longer absorb. None of these four thinkers agree on everything. Tainter would tell you the moral decay language in Glubb's essay is an unscientific value judgment dressed up as history. Diamond would tell you Turchin's elite competition model is only part of the story next to environmental mismanagement. That disagreement is worth being honest about. This isn't one settled theory, it's four serious, independently derived attempts to explain the same recurring shape, arriving at overlapping but not identical answers. What should unsettle you is how much they overlap anyway, arrived at by different researchers, studying different centuries, using completely different kinds of evidence, archaeological, statistical, narrative, and landing on strikingly similar mechanisms. The Soviet Union is one of the most recent, best documented examples of a similar collapse. And it's worth pausing on precisely because it happened within living memory, with archives and testimony intact, rather than buried under 3,000 years of dirt. Though superpower with nuclear weapons, a vast bureaucratic apparatus, and an empire stretching across a continent dissolved in the space of a few years. In 1091, not through military defeat, but through the accumulated weight of an economy too rigid to reform itself, an elite class that had stopped believing in its own founding ideology, and a system whose complexity had long since outgrown what it could actually deliver to the people living under it. It doesn't fit any one of these four frameworks perfectly. It fits pieces of every single one of them. Here's where it's worth being careful, because the honest answer isn't a clean yes. Tainter himself makes an observation that complicates the doom-laden version of this story. In the past, when a complex society collapsed, its people had somewhere to go, The collapse of Rome meant the reversion to smaller, simpler regional societies, a real and survivable alternative to imperial complexity. Tainter points out that the modern world doesn't have that option anymore. Every habitable inch of the planet is already claimed by some complex state. There's no simpler alternative sitting empty next door to revert to. That could mean modern collapse, if it happens, has nowhere soft to land, or it could mean modern societies are more likely to reform under pressure than simply disintegrate, precisely because there's no easy exit, and everyone still inside the system has an overwhelming interest in fixing it rather than watching it break. And that's really the honest note to end on. Every civilization this video just walked through shared the same underlying mechanism, but not one of them was destroyed by a single cause, and not one of them was fated to fail by some cosmic law that can't be interrupted by human choice. Diamond's own research includes societies that saw the same warning signs as Rapa Nui or Greenland and chose differently, that adapted, changed their institutions, and kept going. The pattern is real. The mechanism is real and increasingly measurable in the data of our own time. But every single case study in this video was still underneath the archaeology and the statistics, a story about choices made by people who could have chosen otherwise, right up until the moment they didn't. That's the part the pattern can't answer for us. It can only show us, again and again going back 3,000 years, exactly where to look. Somewhere between the drought that broke the Bronze Age, the forest that couldn't grow back fast enough on Rapa Nui, the currency Rome kept debasing until nobody trusted it, and the elite classes, every one of these societies quietly overproduced until they turned on each other. There's a single uncomfortable thread running through all of it. None of these civilizations died of an enemy they didn't see coming. They died of a warning they saw perfectly clearly and chose, generation after generation, not to act on until it was too late to matter. That choice is the only part of this pattern that was ever really optional. Everything else, history suggests, just follows from there.